Give me the cube.
Alright.
Everything that needs to be taken care of.
So this is just a brief overview of how I do my renderings. It's not to mean that it's the only way or the best way. It's just the way that I do it and my knowledge of it. So what I've done is I've loaded up a previous model with the matte cap red wax as the default. I'm going to show you how I start up setting things up for my initial renders. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. This particular model is already textured. You can't see it real well because of the matte cap, but it is textured. When you're setting up your renders, a lot of the settings that you're going to be playing with are going to be dependent upon the type of material you're using. So if you're using a dark material that doesn't have a lot of diffuse, your render settings will interact differently with that than, say, a material that's like a basic material with a high diffuse. You're going to get completely different results. So the render setup is going to be dependent entirely on what you're trying to get out of the render with the material that you're using and the texture that you have applied over that material. So basically what I do, and it's, you know, it's that traditional thing, right?
All day.
The first thing I do is I come over here and I choose my material. Now, I use a lot of different materials, but I always seem to come back to materials that have a high diffuse and show shadows very well. You know, have that global diffuse look to them when the shadows are projected through the rendering. So in this particular case, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to actually choose the basic material. And I'm going to go ahead and fill my object with it. So I'll set it to material and color and fill object. So there you can see already there's a difference in the way that it looks as opposed to using, say, a matte cap, which would be a completely different look. If I were to come down here, for example, and choose, oh, let's say Skin Shader 4. You see how it's kind of flat looking, right? Now, with the basic material, the diffuse is set at a lower value than it is on the skin shader. So what I will do is I'll choose the basic material. I'll come into the material properties, into the modifiers, and I'm going to change the ambient and diffuse on it slightly. So I'm going to increase the ambient. I'm going to increase the diffuse just a little bit. I'm going to leave the specular alone because on this model, when you saw the final rendered image that I did, I actually had that basic material applied multiple times. On the horns, around the lips and eyes and the ears, I have some specular in there, and that's actually a copy of the basic material with the specularity turned up, and the graph has been adjusted on that. So I'll go ahead and use this as the flat basic material without the specular. So I've got a material assigned here. I need a material assigned to the helmet and to the shirt. And you can go through the Z plugin and do that if you prefer to do that with a let's see, what is it? Transpose Master? Is it? No, Subtool Master. If you click on that, you can come in here with fill, and then you can select your material or your color. In this case, I already have a texture, so I don't want to do a color. So you can choose material and do it. I'm just going to do it by hand. Correct. It'll go through each subtool one at a time and apply it. You can only do one thing at a time, so you can only do, for example, a color fill or a material fill, etc. So if you're going to apply, say, a white basic material, you'd have to do it twice, once for the color and once for the material. So here you see I have the basic material applied to all the subtools. The eyes, I'm going to apply that custom Zbrush material. So I'm going to actually come into the material palette and choose a slot that has not been used, like Colorize Glow, because when I select that material from Lightbox, it's going to replace the material I have currently selected. And there is that one. Just going in here right now and reselecting the basic material for the shirt. So there are my materials. That's the material I want to use. And now I'm going to go in and set up the first settings for my lights. So what I do is I pretty much use the default lights that are in Zbrush, depending on the material. I'm going to use all 4 lights. So the first one's already turned on. We'll go ahead and turn the second one, the third one, and the fourth one. I don't want this blue in here because I already have a lot of blue. So I'm going to set that to white. I also do not want this third light as a radial light. I don't like the effect that it gives. So I'm going to turn off radial and just use it as a cast light straight onto the object. Straight on. That'll help to backfill some of the areas that get darkened out by the shadow. And it looks like I missed a strap there. Let's go to that strap and fix that little bugger. So I have all 4 lights. Now it's just a matter of tweaking the light settings, and I'll come back to that after I set up my render settings. The lights are there. That's the base light. We go to our render properties now. And here you'll see I'll turn on the wax preview, ambient occlusion. I will come down here to BPR shadow, and I'm going to change the angle on the BPR shadow. So what does that do? Basically, when you render like this, you're going to see a very stark shadow. You see under the chin, it's a very, very hard shadow. The edges are only slightly blurred, and it just casts under the chin. And then of course under the helmet back there and back behind the ear, you can see the shadows there too. That's pretty much all it's doing. I want that shadow to fall farther across the object. So what I'm going to do is change the BPR shadow. And we just go down here and change that angle. If you go to 360 degrees, it's going to cover that whole object. It's going to give you probably something you're not expecting. In this particular case, you got a nice darkening. That's because you've got rays going across that entire surface, right? You still see some sharp angles of the shadow, but they look more natural, like under the helmet, under the chin. What happens if we lower that? Well, if we come back down here and lower the angle, let's say to 200. Now, you've got some dark shadows under the helmet, but you notice that that line is a lot softer. The line for the shadow where the shadow ends under the chin, a lot softer. That's what we're looking for. But 200 is a little bit too high for me right now. I'm going to change it down to about 40. Now, you'll notice we've got some nice hard shadow under the helmet like you would expect, but that edge of that shadow is very relatively blurred. Also under the chin, the shadow's not so strong there, right? This is what I'm looking for. Because on an object in the real world, unless you're in a really, really significant place where you've got a stark light in one place shining on that like a spotlight, the light falls across the object and is diffused across the entire surface. It's not sitting there in a place where if you can't see behind it, that whole place is dark and black, right? You can still see around the edges of that object. So that's what I'm shooting for here. Now I'm going to go back into the lights, and one quick thing I'm going to do first, go into material settings. On the basic material, I want to change my wax modifier. I'm going to set that to 40. It's going to give it kind of a fake SSS. And you notice earlier when I went in there, I went and changed that under my render settings too. I should have set that for enable wax preview. Yeah, right there. So now I'm going to play with the lights. I don't like where this light is sitting up here. What I would like is something maybe a little bit further and above the horn area, maybe to cast down so that the shadow falls down across the eye, and then you'll see shadow cast beneath his jawline there. So I'm going to try moving that a little bit. Light 2, I typically have that in a diametrically opposed position from light 1. Light 3, I almost always leave that centered. Sometimes if there's too much light, I'll just turn it off, but usually I use that to counter the shadow so the shadow is not as strong looking. Light 4, I almost always move that up to the top right. It depends on where I'm putting my first light. If my first light is over in that area, I will not move it there. I'll move that fourth light down to the other side or maybe across. It's just a matter where you want to get that rim light and how you want it to affect the final render. If you don't like it, I mean, you can take it off. It's just up to you. We're going to change some settings here too, so you're going to see some of these lights are going to be a little bit stronger. So we'll go back to light 1. It's at 0.85 by default. I'm probably going to crank that up just a little bit. I'll put it around 1.15. Light number 2, that's kind of a bottom cast light, and it's at 0.3 right now. I'm going to put it about 0.5. I'm going to leave light number 3 alone for now and see how the render turns out with it on. Light number 4 is going to be my top rim light, and I want that one to be a little bit stronger, so I'm going to set it to about 1. Now this is where we would set the BPR and see what our first render looks like. So there is the first. You see the shadows are nice and soft. We've got good light coverage across the entire surface. It's not too dark around the edges. You know, a lot of times if you're using just one light, for example light number 1, you get this real dark look, right? And when you go to render it, it'll just kind of look like it's sitting in a dark place. You see how the edges, especially along the back neck and that lower shoulder, are really dark around the edge. That's what I'm trying to avoid. I don't want to see that right now, because if I put this on a background, I want to be able to use whatever kind of background that I want. I don't want to have to be regulated by that edge. If you put in a light background, that edge is really going to show and it's not going to look right. So I try to do something to get rid of that, and that's where I utilize all four of those lights. So the first render, we pretty much get to where we want to go with this. The only thing I would do differently now is I would go ahead and assign the materials to the horns, which would require me to select it because I don't have it set as a polygroup. And maybe paint in some material around the eyes and the nose. So what I'm going to do is just give you a quick rundown on how I do that. I'm going to go in and I'm going to select the basic material that I have already in the object, and I'm going to copy it. Then I'm going to select some other material that I'm not using here, like Dotso metal, and I'm going to paste that material that I copied into the Dotso metal, which is going to replace it. Now I'm going to go back into the material itself, and I'm going to edit it. And I'm just going to keep it the same settings as the other material. The only difference is I'm going to change the specularity. I'm going to put it about 30, and I'm going to tighten up the specular graph. Now with the standard brush selected, I have no alpha. I'm going to select material only, and I'm going to change my brush size to a small brush, and then I'm going to just paint in, turn off perspective, make sure that doesn't mess anything up, and I'm going to paint in over the tops of the areas that I want to replace that material. And you'll be able to see the material as you're painting it in. This is just put some specular into certain areas, and it works well because these materials are already very similar, so they will blend well together. And there are some settings in the actual render menu you can set that will actually help the blending of that material, and we'll go over that in a second as soon as I get this part done. Do the horns real fast. And there's that material. We render it, and you've got specular, and you've got the kind of that global diffuse look for the skin. A couple things that I do also on this, and this is going to help your render, is really depends on your material, and it depends on the texture that you've got going on. You notice here that I have these wrinkles. Okay, some materials support, the cavity colorization, right? Other materials don't. In this particular case, I didn't rely on cavity detection to colorize the cavities. What I did is I went into the masking, and I selected the mask by cavity, inverted it. At one point I had softened it a little bit, I blurred it, and then I just lightly painted over it with a moderate darker tone. If you look at my texture, and we'll pull this up with just a quick flat shader. You see there's not a lot of heavy patterning to the texture outside of the cavities. So basically I painted in some shadow, I painted in some highlight, and then of course the cavity. And I'm letting the material and the render settings with the lights carry the rest of it. So if you go up here into render settings, you can select this area here that says smooth normals. That'll help to get rid of any kind of tessellation that you've got going on there. Of course, if it's very exaggerated tessellation, it's not going to help a lot, but it will help some. If you go down here to materials blend radius, just under that, I usually set it to around 2 or 3, depending on how much difference I have between the materials. And then I just render from there. And I've already refilled those areas that I painted over, so you won't see that material change now. Those are the basic settings that I use. A lot of it comes down to the BPR shadow, the angle at which it's set. Sometimes I will have to adjust the global strength, because if it's too dark, really dark, I'll set that global strength down to like 0.5, 0.4. And the reason I do that is because when I export this to Photoshop, obviously with the shadow map and the AO map, when you apply that shadow map, it's going to darken your shadows again when you overlay it onto that rendered image. You multiply it, it's going to get darker. So if it's terribly dark in your original render, it's just going to magnify it even more. I kind of take that a step out, so I don't have to adjust it as much by lowering the global shadow strength. You set your blur up 2, 3, 4, 5. Just be careful. The higher you set that blur, the higher you set that, the longer it's going to take to render. Anybody got any questions? And something Odell was asking me earlier today was how I did my eyes, and all my eyes are hand painted textures. I don't incorporate any type of texture map or pre-made map. I just paint them as I need them. You can see that on these eyes. So there's nothing fancy going on there. I paint them to fit the actual model and the actual mood. I don't typically make a specular pass because I usually do the specular inside of Zbrush at the time of my final render, so it's already incorporated. I find with the settings that I use, when I use the shadow map and the ambient occlusion map, the ambient occlusion is already adding significant amount of lightness and specularity to it over the already specular that I built into it. That when I try to put more specular, all it does is just make it look wet. It doesn't really work so well, or it blows out areas. So I wind up not using it so much. As you see here with my lighting and with the texture, I already have kind of a lot of specular already painted in on it. Pretty much. Photoshop, I'll go in, I'll have the render, I'll have the ambient occlusion, I'll have the shadow, and I'll have the mask. And then what I do is I use the mask to clip out the background, and then the shadow I put on, I believe it's a multiply, and then I set it to 50%. Ambient occlusion, I set it, I believe it's overlay, and I set that to usually around 50%. Depends on how strong looking it is. And then I paint the background independent of that, in Photoshop. Basic color dodge burn type thing, custom brushes, comp it, and then rather than use the depth mask to try to do some sort of depth blur, I don't like it. I don't like the way it looks, so I usually just go in and hand blur everything myself. I don't like the way the SSS comes out in Zbrush. What I would do is go into Photoshop and kind of paint it in by hand. This is a 100+ setting on the angle of the shadow, and you'll see here the difference. The higher that angle gets, the more it looks like a global diffuse. So if you go up to, say, let's getting close to 160 here, you'll see that the shadow kind of covers a large portion of the surface. And what you see here, like on the eyebrows and around these horns, that's painted texture. That's not actual reflected light. Not in the sense that it's a highlight from a light source. That's actually white that I had painted in there. So that's where I'm getting my kind of false speculars. Yep, I go in every once in a while and use the BPR filters. Show you real quick here. So I'm going to set this one up as a blur. So we'll change the filter to blur. I'm going to change it all the way to 50. I'm going maximum values so that we can see the result. I'm going to do it based on the depth So I'm going to set this depth, the A. It's going to be my farthest point that I want, which I'm going to set to, well, let's say here, right around the neck. B is going to be my closest point, so I'm going to set that, say, the eyebrow. And I'm going to change the depth to 1. And I'm going to change the radius so you can see what happens. So that's max setting. Now I just start toggling it back. There's 20, 15, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2. I'd probably set it on 2. There is a glow.
Hey guys.
Hey, Elfek.
I guess Ron is not going to show up today, so I'll have to do it without him. If you guys still up for sculpting.
Are you still recording?
Oh, really?
You're done.
Oops, sorry.
Hey, there's the glow that I just set. And it basically did the same thing. I set depth A to the neck area, and I set the depth B to the eyebrow. And then you can toggle that back, reset the glow, set the radius. Whatever the effect is that you're looking for. No. Transparency will have to be driven by a subtool. You'll have to have the render property set up to render transparency. So it's right here, this button under ambient occlusion in the render properties menu. And then you go to that particular subtool and you select that subtool, and you come down here to display properties, BPR settings, turn on BPR transparent shading, and then that particular tool will be rendered transparent. You have a couple of settings here that you can change. It used to be way back when you could render with alphas having a transparency channel, but I don't think that will work on an actual geometry.
Actually, there's the new feature, multi-mesh or whatever it's called.
Oh yeah, multi-mesh.
Yeah. So you can like create. Yeah, go on. Explain.
Yeah, I forgot about multi-mesh. You could probably do it with multi-mesh, but that's a little bit beyond what I'm going to explain here. Multi-mesh is based on the geometry. If you can envision, you can use any geometry for it. Of course, the denser the geometry, the more it's going to take a toll on your system as it renders. But you can get some good results with it. There's a lot of tutorials on YouTube for that you can look up. They'll show you exactly how to replace geometry into the multi-mesh and render it out. And you can do that either in a uniform pattern, or you can do it randomly. I mean, I believe you can mask areas off and apply it in that fashion, so you should be able to get the holes. Now, if you're wanting holes that are uniform or have some sort of base pattern, that would be a great way to do it. If you're talking about holes that are just random tears and things like that, I wouldn't use the multi-mesh.
If it's stairs and stuff, there's a nice trick with Dynamesh. Just make a whole Dynamesh it, make a whole Dynamesh it, make a whole Dynamesh it. And then you get all those stairs, and it looks kind of organic and nice.
Yep. That will work too. Any more questions? No. You can. I mean, you've got fiber mesh, right? So you could kind of, sort of, do some fiber mesh type particles that may work. I mean, obviously you could do things like plants and things like that. You can do flowers, etc. You could probably use the multi-mesh to replace your fiber mesh geometry with other particles, right? For example, I guess you could probably create tiny low geometry pebbles and put it on a fiber mesh with the insert mesh, or the multi-mesh insert. I'm losing track of what this is. Anyway, that by replacing that geometry with it, right? And you could get that effect. Is it going to be like any particle simulation program? I doubt it. But that's beyond me. I don't use those programs. My first thing would be try to use Zbrush, obviously. So it might be a hit or miss. I don't know. That'd be excellent for somebody to give it a try and see if you could do something more than just, plant material, vegetation. I know that I saw there was a gentleman in ZBrush Central that did a dragon egg, and was using fiber mesh, I believe, with the replacement mesh, where he created the entrails and the inside of the egg, which is really cool.
Must have used some transparency, something like that.
I don't know. It may have used transparency, but I wasn't really paying attention to that. I was too caught up in the details of the inside of that thing. It was really cool.
I remember seeing it. He did the whole dragon inside, right?
Yeah, the whole thing. It was really cool. Yeah, I've used it in conjunction with like light caps, and I haven't used it a whole lot. I mean, I don't use light caps a whole lot because it has a tendency to become specific to that material that you're using at the time, and you have to reload everything in order to change materials, etc. But the HDRI stuff you can use to create a background, which is really cool because you can convert that into a light cap. So you can take the HDRI values and convert that into light caps and create lighting from that without the actual texture, which I have done, and it is kind of cool. But that's basically it. That's how I set up my renders. That's everything I look at when I start rendering. That doesn't mean that everything turns out that way. It's just that that's where I start. All right, then. All right, guys.
No, that's good. Thank you. I appreciate it. I was muted and couldn't answer.
Have a good one, guys.